I'm Jeff Colgan. I'm the director of the Climate Solutions Lab, and it is my great pleasure to host this event. I'm going to give a proper introduction for our guest in just a moment, but since we are here on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the 1973 OPEC oil crisis, as a professor, I can't resist giving like a 2-minute potted history of that event, and so I'm going to do that, and then sit down and this is kind of just a warm-up for the main event. And so let me give you just a timeline. 50 years ago, on October 6th, the Yom Kippur War began with a surprise attack from Egypt on Israel. And many other countries joined in. US support for Israel angered the Arab world. And that led ultimately to an embargo by Arab oil producers. It was actually OAPEC that embargoed the United States and a set of other countries. And that meant, of course, something of an economic shock here in the United States. And so in November of that year, the Nixon administration tightened some price controls on gasoline, and they were worried about inflation. And basic economics tells us that when there's not enough supply for the large demand that there is and the price is fixed, then you get shortages. And so what that meant was that by February of 1974, 1 in 5 gas stations in the country had no fuel to sell whatsoever. So there were huge lineups of cars waiting to get gasoline at various fuel stations. And this was one of those events that was sort of seared into the public memory at the time and signifying this massive shock to the economy. By January 1974, world oil prices had quadrupled. And that led to a whole bunch of economic and political consequences. It was, for the oil producers, the oil exporters of the world, the largest peaceful transfer of wealth across borders in all of human history. Right? So they got very wealthy very rapidly. For the United States and for Europe, North America, it was not so pleasant. It led to an economic recession and something called stagflation. And it also led to a number of political consequences, which we're not even going to touch today, but it did mean the creation of some international organizations that are familiar to you, the Group of Seven, the G7, and the International Energy Agency that are still both operating today. If you want to know more, I got a couple books to recommend to you. We're not going to go there. What we are going to do is just think a little bit and reflect on energy transitions then and now. Right? So in the 1970s, there was considerable government intervention in reaction to this energy shock. And countries did very different things. So France went nuclear, basically. It went to building a civilian nuclear industry, which powers most of its electrical grid even today. The United States tried energy efficiency measures. Jimmy Carter famously suggested putting on a sweater. Didn't work out for him politically very well, but that was the idea. The United Kingdom and Norway developed North Sea oil. Alaska developed their oil at the same time. Denmark began work on the modern wind energy sector, which, of course, now is gone global. Denmark also invested very heavily in a latex solution called bicycles, which is why Copenhagen is a lovely city to live in now. And Japan mostly suffered. They did not have a lot of energy options, and so they just continued to pay higher prices for the fossil fuels that they imported. Today's energy transition, of course, the ultimate goal is to replace fossil fuels with low-carbon alternatives. And again, we are seeing considerable government intervention. This has changed over time, where it was the Chinese that really were leading the most government intervention for a long time, then Europe, and most recently the United States in the last few years has moved in that direction as well. And so far, we've seen lots of new renewables. So we're seeing investment in renewables ramping up very rapidly, but we are not yet seeing a decline in the fossil fuels. Right? So those renewables aren't replacing the existing ones. Okay. So now the main event. Today, I'm really pleased and honored to welcome back to campus Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. He represents Rhode Island in the United States Senate, of course, where he is one of the leading voices for climate change. And he is fighting to position America at the forefront of the clean energy economy. He is chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, a senior member of the Environment and Public Works Committee, and co-founder of the Senate Climate Action Task Force to build support for action to address carbon pollution. Senator Whitehouse shaped major parts of the historic Inflation Reduction Act, which passed last year, and more recently introduced legislation establishing a price on carbon and a carbon border adjustment. So I hope we'll talk about that in a moment, which would give American companies a step up in the global marketplace while steering the planet towards climate safety. He has also crafted policies to curb profiteering by oil companies and combat the influence of fossil fuel money in our politics. He served as Rhode Island's U.S. Attorney and State Attorney General before being elected to the United States Senate in 2006. A graduate of Yale University and the University of Virginia, Senator Whitehouse has nonetheless been a friend of Brown University for many years. So welcome back. Thank you so much for being here. Yeah. So, I wonder, as somebody pointed out in the audience already, today is your birthday, so happy birthday. Thank you so much for being here. So I wonder if, given that this is not the only anniversary we're celebrating today, if you could just take us back to think about where were you in 1973 and what did this event mean?
I recall odd and even days.
Tell us about that.
Depending on your license plate, if it ended in an odd number and it was an odd number day to go to the gas station, you could go line up. If you had an even number license plate, you weren't allowed to buy gasoline that day, so you had to organize it, and odd days and even days. Yeah. And the echo of that I see now is with the invasion of Ukraine by Vladimir Putin, and the instantaneous reaction of the international oil cartel to jack up prices, and the choice that presented the American oil companies. They're making buckets of money. Do you keep your prices level because you have an obligation to your country and to your customers, or do you follow the international cartel and take advantage of its price gouging? And of course, they chose the latter. And that gave Exxon roughly $80 billion in profit, the largest profit ever reported by a corporation in the history of the planet. So the ability of this industry to take advantage of world events and to gouge consumers is unchanged since 1973. And they defend it with an enormously powerful political operation that I spent a lot of my time trying to poke holes in.
We were speaking actually just a few minutes ago about some work that you're doing on that with regards to the Supreme Court's role on that money. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, we had a little victory today, my birthday present. I've been badgering the Supreme Court about allowing phony front groups to come in and file what are called amicus briefs. You're not actually a party to the case, but you file a brief and offer your views to the court. And what they've been doing is letting flotillas of a dozen or so phony front groups all come in without disclosing who's really behind them. So we do the research on what we know about who's behind these phony front groups, and then I file a brief that says, okay, these 12 phony front groups showed up, and here's who's funding them. And it's always like the same top 5 funders. And what they really ought to be doing is filing a brief in the name of the big 5 funders rather than sending in fake flotillas of front groups. And the Supreme Court has been unsurprisingly complicit in letting that continue to happen because it's the same front groups that help them get on the court. So that many of the justices get on the court. So it's a little bit of a self-dealing situation. But under a lot of pressure, the Judicial Conference, which is the administrative body of the judiciary, and it's all the circuit court chief judges. Chief Justice Roberts chairs it, but the rest of them are all regular judges, chief judges. And they just announced that they have a proposal to put an end to that they're going to vet for the Judicial Conference to approve. So with any luck, it'll be harder for ExxonMobil to send in the Pacific Legal Foundation to make the Exxon arguments in the name of the Pacific Legal Foundation.
Terrific. That's great news. Great news.
We'll see. They're clever, so you put a rule and they'll adapt, but we'll keep hunting, and this was a win.
Yeah, yeah.
At least it's not just the Wild West for phony front group briefs.
So comparing, again, sort of 1973 to 2023, when you think about the other 2 branches of government, legislative and executive, what parallels do you see, and what lessons can we learn from that previous attempted energy transition or partial energy transition? How can we put that in place today?
I don't know. I can't really, it's a 50-year interval, and a lot has changed since then. I think probably the biggest thing that changed since then was the Citizens United decision in 2010 that powered up just massive political effort and clout by the fossil fuel industry. The International Monetary Fund has been tracking how big the subsidy is for fossil fuel in America, and the latest, I think, was over $700 billion. That's billion dollars, and that's basically what they get by way of a subsidy for not having to clean up all the environmental and other damage that they do. So if you're protecting a $700 billion annual subsidy, and the Supreme Court suddenly says, open season, spend as much as you want, the amount of dollars that flowed into the political system can be just explosive, and it's been really dramatic, and it's been particularly dramatic because the fossil fuel industry has been able to hide that it's them behind groups with names like Americans for Prosperity and so forth. So it's created this very rotten setup that I have to fight with on a regular basis. And so, Nixon was a Republican president who put price controls on oil and gas. Fat chance today. I mean, they didn't work, so there's a whole separate economic argument about that. But just politically, the fact that a Republican president could do that, that's kind of a stunner.
Right. Things have changed.
Yeah, things have changed.
Yeah.
It's like, if you think of the Republican Party as the latex glove, and you think of the fossil fuel industry as the hand within it, that's not a bad analogy. When we were trying to solve the problem of the debt ceiling, and the MAGA crowd in the House was basically trying to blow up the credit of the United States as the threat if we didn't do what they wanted. What they wanted was that famous 315-page bill that then Speaker McCarthy cobbled together. Out of 315 pages, 275 were fossil fuel giveaways. Wow. Just to give you an idea of how much fossil fuel hand there is in the glove.
Remarkable.
So that's the really big difference. It's the ownership and control of the Republican Party and the massive political clout and fakery that they're allowed to engage in.
Well, tell us about the more positive story on some level that you helped get the Inflation Reduction Act passed.
Yeah.
And of course, you helped put together this political coalition that passed, so that the act passed with the smallest of margins.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that. Give us the inside scoop, if you will.
The inside scoop is that in the Senate, there is a provision in the Budget Control Act that allows a measure to pass the Senate as long as it contains only financial and fiscal measures without being filibustered and without requiring a 60-vote cloture. So you get really one chance to put what's called a reconciliation bill through, and if you're the majority party in the Senate, it's the one thing you can do without being obstructed by the other side. So we did it, and that's where the IRA came from. And the tax provisions were ones that we put together. I'm on the Finance Committee, and we put together the tax provisions in the Finance Committee and passed them out of the committee. It's essentially automatic that if it comes out of the Finance Committee, it's reconciliation worthy and it gets into the bill. So that was made it easy parliamentarily to have it fit. And then my provision in the Environment Public Works Committee to put a fee on methane emissions also passed muster. It got mansionized a bit in order to allow him to vote for it, but it got in there. And because it was it had penalties and was affected the fisc, then that got in too. And those are basically the key parts of the bill. So it's been good. I mean, it's the first time we've ever passed a piece of legislation that materially reduces fossil fuel emissions. That's the good news. The bad news is that when we say we just passed the strongest fossil fuel bill in history, we mean against a baseline of 0.
Right, right.
Way to go, guys.
So, I mean, 2 weeks before the bill passed, Joe Manchin says, you know, I can't support this, no way. And there is a huge national conversation about the fact that this bill is going to die. And somehow, you know, he came around and there was enough pressure on all of the sort of factors to make this happen. So,
well, I can't talk about the in-house negotiations, but kind of a good news, bad news story. The bad news is that corporate America, once it gets outside of its corporate precincts, is essentially horrible on climate. You know, even companies that have really good climate policies internally and have a chief sustainability officer and put green pictures all over their shareholder reports, they'll come to Congress through a trade association that either tells us don't do anything or don't do anything and we'll really punish you. I mean, the trade association input on climate is disastrously bad. Best case, useless. Worst case, affirmatively evil. So it's not a great place for them to be, and I have to offer that as the backdrop to this. But I do think that when Senator Manchin said he was pulling out completely, there was a sense of panic that really, we can't come away from this with nothing. This is a once-in-a-million opportunity with all 3 houses controlled by Democrats, with a reconciliation clearing bill that the Parles have approved and that we're, you know, good to go on. And I believe he got a lot of calls from CEOs and big shots who he respects, who said, Joe, you got to get back in there. Got to get back in there and figure something out. You cannot let this opportunity pass. And to his great credit, he did not. We came out with quite a good bill.
Terrific, terrific. Well, cheers to that. Tell us about, I mean, you mentioned the kind of key role of reconciliation and the parliamentarian that has to make decisions.
Make that call,
right,
exactly.
About what fits in the box.
A lot of pressure on Elizabeth McDonough, who's a wonderful, wonderful person.
So I can't help wondering, as a political scientist, we have seen a lot of norms violated in the last 6, 7, 8 years, and whether there's a risk of politicization of that particular role. Seems like such a crucial role.
Well, you know, it already has been politicized. The original rule was the only way you get a reconciliation bill through is if it reduces the deficit. That's why it was put in. And a parliamentarian said, that's what it's there for. Yeah, it has to reduce the deficit. So the Republicans then in charge fired the parliamentarian and brought in another one who would say, no, all it has to do is affect the deficit. And that's how they pushed through tax cuts that blew the deficit up through reconciliation. So it's already been a little bit compromised that way. But I do think that there's considerable bipartisan interest in protecting the existing reconciliation rule so that you cannot purely legislate through reconciliation, that there has to be some fiscal connection to it. So I think it's a little bit unlikely that that would blow up.
Yeah. Well, let me take you to a different topic then. Well, actually, let's stay with the IRA. The IRA, of course, is the largest piece of climate legislation ever passed, at least in the US. But 1 year on, most of the spending associated with that bill is happening in Republican-controlled red states. So tell us a little bit about why. What's the logic to that?
I think the logic to that is that a lot of the spending is happening in areas that have a strong manufacturing sector. I think that there was a lot of punishment of the American manufacturing sector, particularly when we tolerated China basically wholesale stealing jobs from America, and what we get back from that was lower consumer prices. But I think a lot of resentment grew in those places about what had happened, and you saw Trump talk about, the dark, ashen cities of America, and he was or towns of America. That was pretty much what he was referring to. So to me, it's a good thing that manufacturing is resuming in places where manufacturing had a base, because the workforce is there, the facilities are often there, and frankly, the people who got left behind were treated very unfairly.
Yeah. So is there a political element to this in the same way that we might expect an effort to repeal the Inflation Reduction Act down the road in a Republican-controlled Congress? Is there a political logic to this of trying to embed the Inflation Reduction Act in a
No, because I don't think it was deliberate. I don't think anybody said, okay, let's pick all our red states and cite them there. I think the superabundance of projects happening in red states happened because of the manufacturing history and profile there. The so-called Rust Belt is the place where the revival is happening fastest.
So ExxonMobil's has a new acquisition, $60 billion proposed deal to acquire Pioneer Oil. And I wonder, you've already mentioned a little bit about the influence of the fossil fuel industry. What are your thoughts on this sort of super merger that's happening? I mean, just got announced last week.
Well, if you had any doubt that the fossil fuel industry is lying through its teeth when it pretends to purport to be steering towards a clean energy future, this deal ought to just put the stake through the heart of that belief, because this is clearly an all-in investment on more polluting fossil fuels. So, it sort of confirms what I've believed, which is you just cannot trust them at all. Anything even remotely green that they say is greenwashing, and they run a very powerful political operation to kill anything that would move in the direction of clean energy. So to me, it's this is no surprise, of course. And it provides also, additional revenues, additional support for them to pile into politics. The solution here is to make sure that people know who the donor is of big bucks into politics. When the Supreme Court decided Citizens United, it said that this was probably going to be corrupting, except that it was going to be transparent. So the voters could see at the end of the ad, we're ExxonMobil and we approve this message, and then they'd understand the motives and the bias and everything else that citizens need to understand to be effective citizens. And then, of course, they've never policed that, and the result is billions and billions and billions in dark money. But if an ad drops in Rhode Island that says, Sheldon is really terrible on climate stuff, we really don't like him, vote against him, we're ExxonMobil and we approve this message, I would say, could you run that again? Because once citizens understand the story, it's like, oh, great, yeah, Sheldon's fighting for us, that's cool. Instead, it's, Rhode Islanders for peace and puppies and prosperity will drop in an ad saying that I'm, corrupt and crooked and, hate children and puppies and all that kind of stuff. And nobody gets the joke. Citizens are deprived of the knowledge of what's happening. All they see is the nonsense advertisement on their TV screen. And it's kind of spooky when a group you've never heard of is in your TV. So we can fix this problem without having to outspend them. All we have to do is put a spotlight on what they're doing, then the public will figure the rest out.
So for the record, you are pro-puppy.
I am affirmatively pro-puppy.
Good. You have introduced legislation on a carbon border adjustment.
Yes.
So what is that and why is it important?
So we're actually in a pretty good place on this because the European Union has already passed its carbon border adjustment mechanism, acronym CBAM. And the CBAM is going to go into effect, I think, next year on a reporting basis so that people can see what they would owe. And then in 26, I believe, it kicks in with actual euros that have to be paid. And it's a tariff. If you want to import goods into the European Union, they will look at whether your country, your industry, or your company is more carbon intense than EU. And if it is, you have to pay a fee that makes up the difference. So the EU CBAM is a very good thing. I'm strenuously urging the Biden administration to get with that program and be supportive of it and do a matching one so that US folks get absolved from having to pay the tariff. But even if we sit this out, the effect of it, because China will have to pay so much bigger a tariff than we will, is that on the economics, if you are an EU company with a supply chain, it will make economic sense for you to move your supply chain from China to the United States because the price savings of dealing with China will be more than offset by the tariff differential between us and China. So big industries like cement, steel, aluminum, pharma are winners in the US from the EU CBAM. And if we lean in, it gets even better. And of course, exhortation doesn't work on pollution. You really have to put a penalty on it. And this will put a big penalty on China. In order to make it work, it's also pretty important to try to put an internal carbon price on, and that is going to be where the battle is fought, because there's bipartisan support for a tariff.
Okay. And so what does leaning in look like for the United States? Is it a carbon price or is it something else?
Well, I mean, in the first instance, I think that the Biden administration should be sending people over to the EU to start having serious discussions about what they'll give us credit for and what they won't, and what we need to do so that when it does go live, American companies don't have to pay a tariff. And they've been sort of dodging around that with a separate thing called the steel and aluminum arrangement, but I think that finally has petered out, thank God. And now they'll have to address this more directly, which is a very, very good step.
Yeah, terrific. Well, I'm just checking my watch because I want to leave time to all of you to let you have questions as well. Maybe I'll ask one more and then invite you to come up to the mics and ask questions of the senator. It's hard to pick just one last question, but I will go with, I am startled by what's happening in China in the electric vehicle industry. It has really taken off in China in ways that I think most Americans and most Europeans have not grasped at all. And so
I think the Norwegians have, but
okay. So what does it mean for the U.S. and for others that this is happening in China? And is this a replay of the sort of the Japanese wave of cars that came in the 70s and 80s?
It could be. I mean, the Chinese to their own benefit, obviously, and for perfectly good reasons for themselves, are very keen to capture markets. And to the extent you can get a technological lead by building a lot of stuff and fixing all the glitches along the way and putting out a really good product, then you can export it. Look what happened after 1973 to the US auto market. European imports flooded in because they were just better as well as more fuel efficient than the way American cars were being made at the time. So I think China could well play into that space. I do think that the infrastructure and IRA and CHIPS bills all create a lot more support for the competing American industries to be successful in the meantime, and there are good ones coming along. So I think that's going to work. If I could mention one other thing before we get in there, I think there are two good things happening that I want to flag, that I want to give the Biden administration credit for, because I nag at them a fair amount. One is that the Office of Management and Budget, which is the big central command through which all regulations and everything must go in the White House, has announced that the existing rule for a social cost of carbon, which is basically an internal price on carbon emissions within the federal government, it's on its way through the EPA. It's probably going to be completed within a month. It's serious. It's $190 per ton. It's a real fee. And Shalonda Young, who runs OMB, and her colleague Ricky Revesz, who's a very, very talented climate economist, have decreed that all federal agencies shall apply the social cost of carbon across all decision-making, including like buying fleets of cars. So that can help boost EVs if you're having to pay an internal de facto price of $190 per ton of emissions per vehicle that you buy. So that is all about to happen when the when the carbon price goes live, the social cost of carbon, and that'll be a big deal. The second thing is they have launched a methane task force to police methane emissions. There are enormous methane emissions happening around the world, and they are highly, highly damaging to climate. They're way, way more damaging than carbon dioxide over a shorter period of time. And the methane task force has new satellite technology that can find a methane leak like right down to practically the size of a tennis court. So you can really pin down where the leak is coming from. And my notion is that, like you see smoke pouring out of the window of a house in the neighborhood, the fire department is down the pole, into the boots, into the thing, and sirens on to the site. Same thing would happen here, except it would be with lawyers, with the cease and desist order, the permit being pulled, the criminal or civil complaint, whatever it took to make that stop and get it shut down. And if we can do a good job of enforcement against methane leaks at home, we have credibility to go to the COP, for instance, and say, okay, let's do this around the world. Because there are enormous methane leaks coming out of places like Algeria and Azerbaijan, but we can't go tell them to knock it off when we're having huge leaks out of the Permian Basin. My colleague Eddie Markey likes to say, you can't preach temperance from a bar stool. And we are on the methane leakage bar stool right now, but the methane fee that we passed and the task force that the Biden administration just stood up can get us off the bar stool and can set a really good example, and I think really make perhaps as big a dent as the IRA in greenhouse gas emissions.
That's really great news to hear.
Plus it's fun.
Yeah.
Enforcement is fun.
Over to you folks. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask? Please, and would you mind using the mic?
Thank you for your service. Just a little factoid for those people who weren't around at the time. There were two oil shocks in 74 and 79. In 74, oil prices quadrupled from $3 a barrel to $12 a barrel. Mm-hmm. And then they quadrupled again in 79 from $12 a barrel to $44 a barrel. So just to give you some historic perspective, Citizens Climate Lobby, their version of carbon fee and dividend has been introduced into the House, and I'm wondering if you're going to, if first off, if you could explain carbon fee and dividend to the
Yep.
folks in the audience.
Yep.
And is your bill going to be introduced and how that would work?
Yes, I have two bills. One is a carbon pollution fee, and that is like a fee and dividend system in that you charge polluters a fee either at the point of importation or at the mine mouth or at the wellhead, and then they have to pay that, and that raises, in my bill, $2 trillion over 10 years. It's a serious piece of change. And then you take that $2 trillion and you can run it back to people to really help. I mean, like, you could do the child tax credit and many other good things that completely offset, particularly for lower income people, any additional price that they ended up paying at the pump if the fee worked its way through to the actual gas pump. So that's how that works. And I've got a carbon border tariff that is fairly similar, and it puts the tax on the worst performers in an industry, and they're exempted if they're in the top half of the industry. So it's very clear that you can achieve technological compliance with this quite easily, but you also, as everybody improves, you move the bar up. And that, we believe, will meet World Trade Organization scrutiny in terms of allowing us to charge border tariffs for incoming products and neutralize our tariffs to the EU CBAM. So those how those two things work. And I think this is the fourth Congress that I filed the carbon price with Senator Schatz and Senator Heinrich. The three of us are kind of the climate trio.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the WTO, because of course the WTO compliance of a carbon border adjustment has always been a little bit tricky, and the Europeans especially are keen on making sure that they can continue to be WTO compliant. I'm frankly a little bit less worried about whether it is or not, because it seems to me the goals of a carbon border adjustment are so significant.
If you look at the threats to the planet, and you have like complete upheaval of all Earth's natural systems versus non-compliance with the WTO, I'm willing to make a priority call there.
Thanks.
Thank you for being with us today, Senator. One of the biggest bottlenecks to new energy challenges is the FERC interconnection backlog.
Yep.
And I know they're trying to implement some new rules over the summer, but we still have 2,000 gigawatts in just new energy projects that are backlogged. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how to further streamline that process.
Get a fifth FERC commissioner cleared. At the moment, that's been tangled up in Senate politics. When we get a majority that can move decisions, that'll be very helpful. I also think that the Office of Management and Budget, when it's implementing the Biden administration's social cost of carbon, is really only allowed to force the hand of entities that respond directly to the president, like cabinet agencies. If you're a quasi-independent, like the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, you can't so much be told to do that because you're quasi-independent, but it sends a really strong signal to the commission, and I think they're starting to ask questions about how do they implement that. So if we get a fifth commissioner and have a functioning majority and have this very strong price signal out of the administration, then I think that clears a lot of the decks at FERC.
Yeah, at the back, please. And if you have a question, if you want to just line up on the mic, that would be terrific. But go ahead.
Hi.
Hi.
Oh my God. Hi, Senator. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Before the midterms, before the House lost, or the Dems lost control of the House, the Oversight Committee and the Subcommittee on the Environment led the investigation into big oil's deception, and I believe that your Budget Committee has now taken over the documents, or at least the effort. So I was going to ask, like, how that is going and whether the character of the investigation changes now that it's in the Budget Committee.
I've got to be a little bit careful about what I say. We are coordinating with our House colleagues with regard to the investigation that they were not able to complete, including assisting with the review of documents in the millions, whose review they were not able to complete, so that that very good work, thank you, Ro Khanna and others, isn't lost until we can claim the House back. I think the secret's out enough if you've asked the question that, because one of the worries, of course, is that the Republicans in the House would order the destruction of the documents, so that we'd have to go back and start all over to try to get the documents out of the fossil fuel industry. So we've tried to make sure that that can't happen also, and that's about all I can say. We're doing this a little bit
Thank you.
quietly until the moment comes to make the noise, and it'll be noisy. Hi.
Hi, Senator. Thank you for being here. I wanted to ask, so you've introduced a lot of ambitious legislation throughout your career and recently, but given that Washington is divided and pretty gridlocked right now and for the foreseeable future, how do you think you can actually affect change and bring about consensus when we simply don't have the votes right now to pass a lot of the ambitious legislation you've introduced?
First of all, there are two ways to do it. One, we still do a lot of bipartisan legislating in the Senate, and I've gotten a lot of stuff done that was done bipartisan. The problem isn't so much that one cannot do bipartisan legislation any longer. The problem is more that there are areas of the legislative map in which the shadow of special influence and politics and money is so great that in that area you can't act. And that's been the problem with climate stuff, particularly post Citizens United. Before Citizens United, John McCain ran for president as a Republican with a perfectly legitimate climate platform. And there were 4 different big, serious bipartisan bills kicking around in the Senate. All that died like a heart attack on January 10th, 2010. So it was abrupt. So one still can do that. Where that shadow falls, you have to try to degrade the political influence capability of the shadow caster. And that's why I spend so much time on, the Disclose Act and transparency in campaign finance, and calling out phony front groups and the stables of phony scientists who they prop up to go to the talk shows and all that kind of stuff. Because I think if you can degrade that apparatus, that opens up more room. I mean, there are plenty of Republicans who have really serious climate problems in their state and know how real this is. I'll flag one other thing, if you don't mind. One of the things that I've talked about for a long time now is Freddie Mac, the ginormous American mortgage company, warning some years ago of the prospect of a property values crash in coastal America. A coastal property values crash so severe that it would be a replay of the 2008 mortgage meltdown. And if anybody lived through the economy of that 2008 mortgage meltdown in 9 and 10 afterwards, that's not something we want to replay. And it went well beyond people with bad mortgages. It took out the whole economy because of what economists call systemic risks, systemic effects. So they've warned about this for a while, a coastal property values crash that takes out the American economy. I'm afraid we're starting to see it. And we're starting to see it in Florida, where nearly a dozen property insurance companies have gone bankrupt, where others can't issue policies any longer because they can't credibly issue policies any longer, and where major national insurance companies are leaving the state, which creates a number of problems. The first is, if you want to sell your property to somebody, you're probably going to have to sell it to somebody who wants a mortgage, and you can't get a mortgage if you can't get insurance, which means the whole property market shifts very abruptly from anybody who can get a mortgage can be a buyer to only people who can produce cash can be buyers. And that is a supply-demand adjustment that will crash prices. The second thing that happens, and we've seen this unfortunately in Rhode Island, and I've had to clean up after this, is you have a massive insurance failure. And what's happening in Florida is that as all of these insurance companies either go bankrupt or stop renewing policies or exit the state, everybody is fleeing to a state-backed insurer entity called Citizens Property Insurance, which is insolvent. And as more people pile into it, it gets more and more insolvent. If you look at Idalia, the recent storm, it's over 10 billion in property damage. If you look at Ian, the hurricane, it's over 110 billion in property damage. Citizens has 4 billion in reserves. And it's getting to be hurricane season. And there are 22 million people in Florida. So if you have another 100 billion, let's say it's a $104 billion storm, just to make the math easy, 4 billion wipes out your reserves. Now you've got a $100 billion hole to fill to help people rebuild their homes, and you have no money. So what it's in theory able to do is go to other around Florida and assess other insurance policies. But if you're a $100 billion bill to pay, and you've got 22 million Floridians to pay it, and a third of them are kids, and a third of them are on Social Security and pensions, you're talking about an $8,000 or $10,000 bill, perhaps, to people to pay for somebody else's home being rebuilt. Good luck politically making that work. So there's a very, very significant risk that if Florida has a bad hurricane season, that rolls into a complete economic meltdown in Florida of uninsurable, unmortgageable properties, people who've been wiped out because their biggest asset, their home, has lost 3/4 of its value, and complete upheaval. It's not a good place to be.
Can I just add to this point? Because I have to say, when I think about the economic effects of climate change, this is the scenario that keeps me up at night. This is the sort of canary in the coal mine. And I was writing about this 5 years ago, the idea that we are making bets economically about how bad climate change is going to be. And one set of visions about climate change is the vision that keeps the fossil fuel price, the stock market's prices of the fossil fuel industries very high. And that bet is climate change is going to happen and it's going to be really bad. And if that's true, then the prices of the insurance companies and our homes are in big, big trouble. Or it could be the world that we will solve climate change, but in that case, we're going to need to curb fossil fuels quite dramatically. And one of these things can't be right.
Yep.
And so we are starting to see, I think, not just in Florida, as you pointed out, but in Louisiana, and even
Texas.
Now in California, we're seeing Allstate
With wildfires.
and State Farm
Yeah.
pulling out. And this is not just the homes that are next door to the wildfire, it's the whole state, right, as you say.
Yeah.
So,
We've had several hearings in the Budget Committee on this since I've been chairman, just to lay out the case and help people understand what the risk is. In ordinary times, you lose your home when the storm comes through the door and takes it out. And then an insurance company comes and pays you and you build it, and it's a mess and it's terrible, but it's over. In these times, your home doesn't lose its value when the storm comes through the door. Your home loses its value when your insurer or the bankers predict that a storm is likely to come through that door, and you are no longer a good bet. And that, with 30-year mortgages, could be well ahead of the actual storm.
We have time.
On that happy note,
Yeah, we have time, I think, for just one more question.
there are two people waiting. Let's give them both a shot.
Okay.
I'll give shorter answers. I know it violates Senate protocol to speak briefly, but I'll try.
I'll be quick. Thank you, Senator. As a PhD student here, I'm doing research on the role of labor unions in the energy crisis, the energy politics we were talking about at the beginning in the 1970s. And in light of today, and in particular the potential resurgence of the power of organized labor that we seem to be seeing across the U.S. right now, what role do you see labor as playing in the emergent energy transition that you're helping shape through your legislation?
The carbon pricing bill that I wrote earned the support of the utility workers of America because that $2 trillion over 10 years that it collects from the polluters, you'd use to go into communities where labor unions were being dislocated and workers were being dislocated and make sure that they were taken care of. You could, for instance, put mine workers and utility workers in places where there was distress because of the big plant closed, right on their pensions right now. And it wouldn't cost that much money compared to the damage that we're doing, $700 billion a year, according to IMF, around the country. So it really makes sense to do that. And it also does something else. It also reflects, I think, a very important kind of right thing to do, because the people who worked in a coal plant, for instance, they're not the ones who are responsible for the climate problem. It's the executives and the political types and the lobbyists and the lawyers and everybody who lied about it for years. What they did was powered the most powerful economy in the history of the planet and made their country wealthy and strong. And for them to be treated like energy veterans who came home from a battle that they won, I think is a very fair way of looking at it, and it helps heal the divide of people who work in those companies and those industries feeling that they're disrespected. There's no need to disrespect people who worked in a power plant. That they were not the problem, and frankly, they made a lot of us very wealthy along the way with the work that they did as the American economy exploded.
Last question.
Thank you. So one thing that we've learned is that war is really bad for climate policy and climate politics. Professor Colgan, your lab put out a study this summer, showed that with the cost that the European Union and the United Kingdom spent to procure fuel during the war in Ukraine would have cost 57% of the total cost of renewable energy transition. And so on the precipice of sending potentially tens of billions of dollars in aid to a new conflict in the Middle East, which I should also say that you have generally voiced support for, I'm wondering how you're thinking about that tension.
I see them in different lanes. I know that they overlap because there's one big economy out there. But I see them in two different lanes. I see solving the climate crisis as basically requiring a lot more honesty in politics and a lot more transparency so that the crooked influence of polluting industries is abated, and then a price adjustment. I mean, when energy has to compete against a $700 billion annual subsidy for fossil fuel in the United States, that's a very artificial playing field. And if you can adjust that, if you can make the economics work and the politics work with transparency and proper market theory, then I think the pathway opens up very, very quickly. With respect to Ukraine and Israel, I think we live in a world in which democratic institutions that are generally market-based and in which rule of law is valued and protected are under assault from autocrats and crooks like Putin and from terrorist fanatic organizations like Hamas. And we have to win those fights because that structure of proper democracy, market-based economics, and rule of law is the structure that allows the climate reform to be implemented. So that would be the way I'd kind of oversee it. But you're absolutely dead right that the immediate climate cost of warfare is terrible, just as the immediate environmental cost in Ukraine, for instance, is awful. I don't know how much money they're going to have to spend to try to demine and decontaminate the fields that are now littered with the refuse of war.
Well, on that even happier note, I want to thank you, Senator, again for
The happy
coming.
note is that we can do this.
Yes.
We can do this. We've let time run short, but we absolutely can do this. This is just one of those moments where the burden of citizenship is not light. The job is not easy, but plenty of other American generations rose to moments as bad or worse than that and did everything that they could, and we came through all right. So we'll do that again.
Well, you're here to that.
God willing.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for coming.